Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Hi, Savannah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Today I have Savannah Carlisle. She is a new author. She just had her debut romance novel. I shouldn't say a new author because she's got a little bit of a backstory that we can talk about, but you have your first debut fiction romance, correct, this May?
Yes, the Library of Second Chances came out in May of 2024 and was the culmination of a lot of years of trying to write a novel.
Fun. As Library of Second Chances, I mean, that's giving me romance vibe and book lover vibes. Am I right about both of those things?
Yes, very much so. It all kind of usually when I get an idea for a book, it starts with like one of the characters or something like that. This started with a little free library and the idea behind a little free library. And then I came up with the characters who might be to this little free library. So it really did start from this like love of books and especially little free libraries, which I think are so cute and so much fun.
Oh, they are. I go on my walk every day, and there's one little one that I pass. So every once in a while, I'll put something in and take something out. There's a lot of kids' books in there, so I keep it like PG.
Yeah.
So tell us about your book. Tell us about the characters, the setting.
Yeah, so I got the idea actually during the pandemic, going to little free libraries and noticing that like some of them had their own little quirks and charms. Like they would have other things in there, like, I don't know, they'd bake treats and put them in there, or they'd have like, pens and pencils and bookmarks you could take. Or I went to one and they had like little gemstones, and it was like everybody had their own little thing. And one of the ones I went to, they asked you to fill out a little card and put it inside the book. And you really were just saying, what date you put the book in the little free library. I guess that's so they could make sure they kept it fresh. And I thought, well, what if you asked people to do a little something more and you had people write down why someone else might like this book? Because a lot of times when I go to a little free library, I don't know the authors or the titles. And that's not good or bad. There are so many books out there, but like I want someone to tell me, why I would like this. And so this really started from the idea of, well, if I had a little free library, I would have people write on these little note cards. And then that turned into, okay, well, what if people were writing on these note cards and they started swapping books back and forth with each other? And that somehow allowed them to develop this relationship. And I am a huge fan of You've Got Mail. And I know that there is a new generation younger than me that doesn't necessarily love parts of that movie. But I love Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks together. And I've always loved that movie. And I thought, well, what if they started falling for each other through these books they're leaving for each other and these little notes they're writing, but they hate each other in real life and they've got some sort of feud or something going on in real life. And so it really came from that idea and then trying to figure out like, okay, who are these people? Why don't they get along in real life? And why are they falling for each other through the books? And then what happens when one of them finds out who the other one is? So it's not exactly like You've Got Mail, but that definitely gave me some inspiration.
Well, fun. Yeah, I feel like I think it was even a Christmas Netflix special that was a YA special that somebody left a note in a book and it was supposed to be anonymous, but her best friend ended up getting it or something like that. So it's giving me all those kind of cool mystery vibes as well. And I'm assuming happily ever after, or that's too much for a spoiler alert.
No, definitely. I'm a big believer that like a romance book needs a happily ever after.
Fun. And do you differentiate between happily ever after, happily for now? A lot of people are very particular about that.
Yeah, I will read both, but I have only written happily ever after. Like for me, writing these stories is such an escape and being able to imagine these wonderful worlds where like hardly anything bad ever happens is such a nice escape as a writer and as a reader. So I have only written happily ever afters.
Oh, fun. And tell me about the setting. Are we contemporary setting?
Yes, contemporary. And I was telling you before we hit record, I live on Amelia Island in Florida, and I very much drew inspiration here, although it is a fictional island in the book called Heron Isle.
Oh, fun. Heron Isle, like the bird.
Yeah, and it's like there's a neighborhood here called Heron Isle, and I came up with it was actually like the third or fourth name for the island as I was drafting this book, and I was already done and had decided what I named it. And then I was driving around one day and I was like, oh, that must have been like in my subconscious because there's a neighborhood. I think it's just off the island with that name. So obviously it was stuck in there somewhere.
Fun. And what point of view do we get here?
This is third person. It's funny. I have tried writing in first person and feel like that tends more towards women's fiction, at least in my writing and in a lot of what I read too. So mine have been third person so far.
Fun. Yeah, I wrote my first, I was really like, I was always first person. I thought third person would be way too hard. And I guess maybe you're in one camp or the other, or it was what you get used to. But I finally wrote a third person and it turned out so good. I'm like on the third person bandwagon for romance now.
Well, and I think it's easier because in my other life, I'm a journalist and we're not supposed to write in first person and inject our own opinions, and there are no like I statements. And so it feels awkward to me to write in first person.
Right. Yeah. You really have to, yeah. I mean, you get that, raw point of view in some instances, but you can get that in third person too. So fun. And how you said this took a long time to write. Tell me about that journey.
Well, it's interesting. This book actually is the fastest I think I've ever written a book, with the exception of the book I'm writing right now. My first book, well, the very first one that will never see the light of day, I worked on off and on for years. I'm sure we'll probably touch on it, but I have written nonfiction books and I would play around with fiction sort of on the side. And I had this one that I spent years and years writing, and then finally got feedback from my agent that it wasn't working and sort of shelved it. And then prior to the pandemic, I completed sort of my first novel all the way to the end. The other one I had never ever quite finished, and my agent took it out on submission in early 2020. And unfortunately, that ended up being about a week before the world shut down because of COVID, and it was a terrible time to be on submission. And that book, which I think took me about 2 years to write, sort of died on submission in 2020. And to distract myself while it was on submission, I wrote this book, which ended up being my debut. I wrote it in 45 days,
Oh, wow.
whereas the other one had taken me like 2 years. This one just like came out. It was the pandemic. I wasn't traveling. I remember I started it in December. Like things were slow for me with my job over the holidays, and I just like pumped this book out. And then that's the one that ended up being my debut. And then I'm super excited because that first book that initially died on submission in 2020, it's now going to be my second book. It's coming out May of next year, and so it got another life, which is really exciting.
Yay, congratulations. So will this be a series? Is it a follow-up? Are they completely different standalones?
No, so they're completely different standalones. But I am hoping that the one that's coming out May of 2025 is going to turn into a series. I sort of wrote it with series potential in mind and was like seeding side characters, sort of knowing whose other stories I would want to write. And so I'm hoping that one turns into a series.
Oh, fun. And what is that book about?
So that one was, I don't know how many country music fans you have in the audience, but I for years played around with an idea based on the Miranda Lambert song "The House That Built Me." I love that song. I think it's so beautiful, and I would listen to it and I would ask myself, like, who is this woman in this song? And like, she comes home, and if you don't know the lyrics, like, she's sort of talking about coming back to her childhood home, makes her realize sort of how far she's gotten off course. And she's hoping that kind of by coming back and being surrounded by her childhood home, she's going to remember who she used to be and sort of get back on track, or at least that's what I've always taken from the song. And I started asking myself, like, what happened to her? Who is she? Like, why is she so off track? And then I literally had a dream one night, and I woke up the next morning and I was like, I know exactly who I think she is and what her problem is. And so the character, her name's Callie, and she is sort of a take on Taylor Swift in that she has been discovered as a teenager and turns into this huge country music star. And her label convinces her to make this transition to pop. But unlike Taylor Swift, that transition does not go well for her. And her career sort of ends up in a like landslide that she's having trouble stopping. And she comes back home to help sell her family's home. And is back around her high school sweetheart and back around these other people who were really formative in her life, and is trying to figure out what her next steps are. So I love country music, and it's got some of those vibes in it, and was very much inspired by that song and by Taylor Swift, who I saw for the first time when she was 14 and was performing down in St. Pete, Florida, in I think it was like a 4th of July parade or something like that. And I remember thinking, gosh, this little girl can sing. And then like a year later, she got signed. And I've always sort of had a fascination with her. So I had to sort of work some Taylor Swift vibes in there for everybody.
Fun. Oh my goodness. My grandparents lived there. I can't believe I missed that.
It was
We
a
need to
long
talk.
time ago.
Anyway, both of your books sound super, super amazing. Tell me about, you said you wrote nonfiction work. Tell me about the jump from nonfiction to being a fiction author.
Yeah, so I actually started my career as a corporate attorney, really, really different than what I do now, obviously. But I was a really early blogger, and I blogged about legal issues in sports just for fun. It had nothing to do with my legal practice area, but I'm a huge sports fan. And that ended up leading to me getting a book deal for a sports nonfiction book. And now I'm on my third book deal for sports nonfiction. And in fact, in 2025, we'll have both a novel and a nonfiction book coming out pretty close to each other in the spring and summer. And my area of specialty now on the sports side is the business of college sports. So that book is, for those who follow college sports, that book is about some of the recent changes in the last 4 years or so around athletes being able to monetize their name, image, and likeness. And so this book is sort of a guide for parents and for athletes on how to navigate this new system. So really different than what I write about on the romance side, but I need that. Like when I get tired of one, or I like hit a mental block writing one, I can switch and write on the other one. And I've been really lucky that this year, the way my deadlines have worked, I got to like work on my nonfiction book for a month, and then I was editing a novel for a month, and then I was writing a new novel for a month, and now I'm about to edit the nonfiction. Like I've been able to kind of jump back and forth.
That sounds really fun. Yeah, that reminds me of what I do a little bit because, well, in my fiction work, I jump back and forth between fantasy and romance. And my romance gives me the happily ever after, nothing horrible ever happens vibes. But in my day job, I'm a patent drafter. So I'm very much a technical writer in that sense. So fun. But I'm on a huge romance reader, at least right now. So when I'm writing fantasy, I read romance. So everything on my Audible book right now are all the romance books. So I can't wait to download yours. I think that's going to be so fun.
When I'm drafting, I listen, I do a lot of audiobooks, and I'll listen to thrillers. And I read a lot of romance, but I tend to read it while I'm editing. There's something about reading it while I'm drafting that like gets in my head. And then I'm like, wait, was that their character that said that, or my character? Or, wait, what was the name of my like restaurant or whatever? It's harder to keep it straight for some reason, but love reading books by all my author friends I've made on the romance side. Love women's fiction too, but love thrillers. I could never write one, but I love reading and listening to them.
Oh, fun. That's really neat. Well, thank you, Savannah, so much for being here today. Tell us again where we can find you and your book.
Yeah, I'm at savannahcarlisle.com, and I'm on pretty much all the social media channels, I think, at Savvy Carlisle with 2 V's, because apparently Savannah Carlisle didn't fit on one of the channels. And I was trying to make them all the same. So I'm pretty active on Twitter and Instagram. I try to be active on TikTok, but I have to admit I'm not the best at it. So probably safer to find me on Instagram.
Fun. Well, thank you. Thank you again for being here. And we will have you back next year when you have your new releases.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.